I come back for the outro, will you be able to zoom back out? Yeah? Okay, perfect.
So you're doing the 555 at May.
Yes.
If I were at the last 15.
Yes, I'll give you that 555. I am not ready. Oh, okay. We are live. All right. All right. Hi, and welcome to our lecture for the Mirror Stage Off-Night Community Forums. I'm your host, Megan, and I'm the production manager of Mirror Stage. We are here at 12th Ave Arts on Capitol Hill, and I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that we are on Indigenous land. We recognize that we are on the Duwamish territory and honor their elders past, present, and emerging. This evening, we are joined by Tremaine from the Alliance for Gun Responsibility. We are excited to share with you a deeper dive into some of the themes from our main stage production, The Squirrel Plays, which is happening right on this stage every Thursday to Sunday until May 20th. Please welcome Tremaine.
Thank you. Or as I like to joke, welcome to the Tremaine is Unhinged podcast, where this English major does his best to not take all of your time tonight. Thank you all for letting me be here with you for this evening to kind of talk really around a little bit more of our organization. Often I find that sometimes folks don't know a lot about us, and so sharing a little bit more about the work that we do, the who, what, when, where, and whys of the work that we do, and especially why this work is important when we look at gun violence that happens in our communities, and what we can continue to do as a community to address that. So I will backtrack and start first to the Alliance for Gun Responsibility. So we are about an almost 11-year-old, one could argue young organization here in the state of Washington that was birthed out of inaction after Sandy Hook. And we like to sometimes say the tale of two Washingtons, right? When that inaction of Washington, D.C., was not happening around, all of these young innocent lives being taken in a school, the people of Washington State realized that they most certainly had power to do something about it. And so now bringing us to the organization of who we are today, where we consist of a C3, a C4, and a PAC. And every day our mission is to really end those harms that are happening in our communities by gun violence. And we do that work through advocacy, education, and through partnerships. And so when I also mentioned our C3, our C4, and our PAC, that C3 really gives us the ability to, do public education, to do public programming that really seeks to educate and engage our communities. Much of today, hopefully this evening, you will get some of that, of the work that we do, why it's important, the work that we do, and how folks can even play into this work, because it is a grassroots effort that makes us so strong and makes us successful in our communities. But we do a lot of work around research. We do work around implementation and making sure that the laws that get passed are implemented in our communities, because our laws are only as good as they are implemented in our communities. We also have our C4, which is your political nonprofit, if you will, that allows us to do a lot of the mobilization work that we do around lobbying for life-saving legislation to get passed. That allows us to do a lot of our work around GOTV. For those who are not familiar with that acronym, it is Get Out the Vote. So when election season is coming around, we are out there knocking on doors, we're texting people, we're calling people. And if you're watching this right now and you're a supporter of ours, thank you for enduring all of those phone calls and text messages that we do and will continue to do during those sessions. But we also then have a PAC, right? And that is very much in all things the world of American politics, right? Your space where it allows us to endorse candidates who believe in this platform, who believe in this work, and making sure that we have elected officials in places of power to continue to support this work. Because believe it or not, I think sometimes people who live in the state of Washington or Seattle, right, think that because this state has been arguably in the last many years, right, historically very progressive, that also means that that folks in those positions of power are also folks who believe in gun violence prevention, who believe in gun reform. And really, we didn't have those gun sense majorities in our legislatures until about 5 years ago. So it takes work in all those many different levels to address what's happening in our community and making sure that people who are passionate about that work are in those spaces with us. So with that, it's also important to talk about sometimes, additionally, the whys, right? Why does the Alliance for Gun Responsibility do the work that it does every day, right? And I could sit here and give you a plethora of unfortunate statistics, right? But I think one of the ones that we have really been living in, unfortunately, as a country lately has been, this is now officially the leading cause of death for American youth. And I'm looking right here down because I always keep my notes with me, and we have our new annual report that is just getting ready to come out. And in this annual report, right, it's reviewing 2022. And in 2022, we looked at this document that said, firearms are the second leading cause of death, which means in our society, we have now unfortunately surpassed automobiles, which were usually the leading cause of death, right? That surpasses cancer, that surpasses illness, that surpasses poisonings, all these other things that arguably as a society, arguably as a country, we are fighting every day. We're putting resources in every day to approach them and to address them. And so as an organization, we also believe that it's time to take those same approaches, right? Arguably, many of those are very public health approaches when you talk about illnesses as well, right? To really address that. So we're an organization that also believes in this work being a public health approach in everything that we do. Because when you also look deeper, right, if we go even a little bit deeper into those numbers as a country, right, we're losing annually around 45,000 people in this country. And something that doesn't get talked about when we also break those numbers down is that a majority of those deaths are by firearm suicide, which I take that intentional pause for a reason. That I think that's just as a baseline, that's really important for people to hear, because I think sometimes in our society, it is very sensationalized sometimes, unfortunately, around our mass shootings. And most certainly we never seem, or never want to, minimize those conversations, because that is most certainly important to continue to have those conversations. But sometimes we forget to talk about the real harm of these weapons, right? Are people taking the lives of themselves? And it's really important to have those conversations and deep dive into those conversations, especially when we talk about a public health approach, when we talk about the importance of gun violence prevention, because sometimes, right, we are combated with, right, sometimes that myth of, you need more good guys with a gun to combat a bad guy with a gun, when the reality is you are more at risk at home always with a firearm to yourself or to your loved ones. It is rare that somebody actually outside of your home is going to come inside of your home and cause harm to you. It is usually folks that are living inside of your home who may be living with a mental illness, right? Who may be struggling with something and take their lives themselves. How many times have we unfortunately seen in the news now? Just today, there was one, and I can't remember where it was, but it was I take it back, it was in Grand Rapids, where they are getting ready to change the school policy around backpacks, because a third grader had a firearm in his backpack, right? We also have to talk about, if it's not people taking their lives, right, it's our children getting hands on these firearms. It's them unintentionally shooting themselves or others in their home. Something that I have been sharing a lot lately is even my personal story when I talk around these as well, because the first time I ever held a firearm was at 5 years old, and it was for the lack of safe storage, right? It was for the lack of very much these common sense measures that we can take as a community to address what is happening, that also allows us this world of duality, that two things can be true. I think our Madam Vice President said it just a couple of weeks ago, right? That we don't have to live in this society where it has to be either or. It doesn't have to be black or white. Two things can be true. You can have your rights balanced with responsibility. Often on our side, when we hear things, right, of the Second Amendment, we always like to push back of like, we hear you. We also believe in the Second Amendment, where that first line strongly states a well-regulated. It starts out very much strongly at the beginning of the importance, again, of if you are going to have these weapons that create harm, that can cause death, that there is legislation that really has that conversation around what we need to do to make sure that we're having safe access to these items if you are going to have access to them, right? I think it's also important that it's very built into our name that we try to live in this space of common sense measures, right? We're the Alliance for Gun Responsibility. So every day realizing that there is a place to play for folks being responsible firearm owners. And that means, which the majority of Americans do believe on both sides, right? Background checks, making sure that we have universal background checks, right? Safety trainings, many of the things that I'll hint on later when I open up my notes around this past legislative session, some things that we did to address that, right? But safety trainings, background checks, the importance of safe storage, right? The overwhelming percentage that is behind that when you automatically lock your firearms up at home, it exponentially decreases the risk of harm for others in your household, to cause harm to themselves, unintentionally to themselves, right? But we also will entertain, right, if somebody were to break into your home and to steal your firearms, if they are locked away, it minimizes the risk of someone getting those hands on those items and causing harm to others in their community. So I want to dive a little bit into that a little bit, because now that I've alluded it, I want to pull up my notes to talk a little bit as well around our legislative session. I talked about our C3, our C4, and our PAC, right? And it's important for our PAC work, and it's important for our C4 to get folks who believe in this work in elected places and spaces, as I like to say, all the places, all the spaces, all the people in all the places, because, right, one, implementation matters to make sure the laws that get passed, but two, right, when these elected officials who believe in this platform, who believe in this work are elected, when we go to legislative session, we know that we've got champions in our legislature who believe in this work and who want to help support this work. And because of that, right, because of us, I often tell our partners as well, right, when, we just had this very historic legislative session that passed, and, a lot of our partners reached out and were like, oh my goodness, you guys did it, it's amazing. I always like to rebuttal that we did it, that our efforts did it, that our victory is belonging to all of us, because we can't do this work without all of our grassroots supporters, right? We can't do this without them, because they help us get the folks that need to be elected into office, who help get these legislative bills passed. And I do want to go through some of our legislative victories. I don't want to go through some. I want to go through all of them, because if any of my coworkers are watching this later, I know they will get me if I don't list all of them. But it was a good great historic legislative session. We sought out this year to get 9 GVP, gun violence prevention bills, passed this year, and much of which that I'm going to read to you. If you're thinking, oh my goodness, he's saying so many things to me, the perk is on our website, which will follow up at the end of this. You can see all of these things and more information. But for our legislative session this year, going off of even last year, we felt really good of making this a historic year. Last year's legislative session in 2022, we got a lot of things done, but high capacity magazines, the restriction and the ban on high capacity magazines, more than 10 rounds, was passed in our state. And from that moment, we felt, okay, great, we've got a good runway here, that the people support this work, our elected officials are behind this work, and it has now become not only a hot topic in our country and in our communities, but it's become a winning topic. And it's really been important for our elected officials to see that as well, that it's not confrontational. It shouldn't be confrontational to talk about these things, because people are dying literally every minute in our country. And it's important to continue to do work, to continue to pass bills that have a more upstream approach. Because, and this is part of the jokes of the Tremaine is Unhinged podcast, because I'm going to get to those bills, but I got to say it while it's in my head, right? A lot of the work that we are seeking to do, right, is very much this upstream approach. I like to give folks often lately this analogy, if you will, of, if the factory is up here at the top of the mountain or the hill, right? And there's a stream coming down and you got the puddle at the end and it's polluted, right? The easy thing might be to consistently say, oh my goodness, it's polluted, let's clean it up, right? They have that very reactionary moment to clean it up. However, right, if we don't go upstream to address the harms, the causes, the root causes of what are actually polluting the lake, right? What is actually harming our fish and our ecosystem and the folks who drink the water, right? That shows even then that the harms that play to those folks, we truly won't get anywhere that we need to be. And so this legislative session also was a part of that work of really continuing to have that upstream approach, right? To have this work really address those root causes as best as possible, to provide solutions ahead of time to make sure that we can minimize what is happening in our communities and not wait for something to happen and then send more thoughts and prayers, because thoughts and prayers are not going to get things done. It's policy and change that is going to get this done. And I'm really proud these last couple of years, this organization as well has really been intentional around our work of passing bills that also shift some of that accountability to our manufacturers and our dealers, because also, as we know in this country, right, when bills are passed and as we talk about implementation, right, those laws impact communities differently, and they are going to disproportionately affect communities differently. And so it's really important to look at this from a space additionally, right, of, well, let's go upstream, right, and let's have this conversation about our manufacturers and our dealers. Let's go directly to the top and make sure that we can do everything that we can do to continue to keep our communities safe, because this work does work. Laws do change things, right? Even just this past year, Washington State has about a 74% rate of firearm deaths, and it's dropped to about 71%, right? And those percentages matter. Every life that is saved matters, but our goal, right, is to always get that down to zero, right? But that helps with the passing of laws, right? It is not the one-stop shop approach to how we solve these things, but it most certainly is a part of that ecosystem of things that does that work. And so looking into this past legislative session, right, we sought to pass 9 bills to continue to address the work of gun violence prevention, and we were able to walk away with 8 of those 9 bills passing. So not only for our organization was that very historic, arguably very tiring, but it was worth all of the work. But we became a part of history. We became the 10th state to ban assault weapons in our country, along with a few other things. But I will start, of course, with that one, because that is most certainly our top tier one this year that became a part of history for obviously our state, but for the country, the 10th state, which was HB 1240, which restricted access to assault weapons, especially important because, assault weapons have been used in some of the deadliest mass shootings in the last 10 years in our country. And so this bill ensures now that Washington became the 10th state to ban the sale of military-grade firearms across all of our communities. This is also a victory in the making, and one that will ensure that assault weapons are not sold in Washington state, right? Again, this is a part of an impactful piece of legislation that addresses a thing that we knew was happening and needed to be addressed to minimize these mass casualties that are happening in our communities and in our country. But also a part of the work was our HB 1143, which implemented a 10-day waiting period and mandated safety training for the purchase of all firearms. And so this bill, requires safety trainings at a 10-day waiting period to purchase any firearm in Washington. And it states with similar precautions, similar precautions have lower rates of firearm-related death. We have fewer guns diverted to criminals shortly after retail sale, and lower rates of guns exported to other states, right? Again, laws won't be the only thing that changes this, right? Societal changes will need to happen, continued work in CVI, community violence interruption or intervention, right? But it also just goes to show, right, that laws do help. Laws do change things. Laws have historically always helped change our society and the way that we think and the way we approach things, and this will certainly be a part of that work to continue to address that. We also had SB 5078, which is the Access to Justice for Victims, which was something that was really important and really impactful, especially as I talked about, the shifting of culture around accountability. This was a bill that helped with that because for far too long, federal law has prevented gun violence victims and survivors from holding gun dealers and manufacturers accountable for dangerous and irresponsible practices. And so this means that now the gun industry has been able to engage, in reckless and dangerous practices without fear of consequences. And I think that's really important to note, right? Because we still feel that every day, right? It's something that we continue to fight and address every day, that every time there is a mass shooting, right? People are expecting it to just be thoughts and prayers and not policy and change, because there needs to still be this continuous work of the gun lobby who has infiltrated many spaces, arguably our politicians, to making us think, not only, again, right, black and white, that it's the bad guys with a gun, it's not the good guys with a gun, but somehow guided us into this thinking that we can't do anything about it. And this bill helps us very much to address some of that. And SB 5078, right, ensures a pathway for victims and survivors of gun violence to hold industry leaders accountable for wrongful and dangerous business practices, and ensures that victims have a method to seek justice. I love all of our bills, but I am happy to go on record to say that this is arguably my favorite, because, again, it gives justice to our victims, but it also is a continuation of shifting our culture of accountability on our dealers, on our manufacturers. Again, very, very much that upstream approach. If we know who are creating these items that are causing harm in our community, we most certainly should manage what that access looks like. We most certainly should have conversations of what that access looks like, how we go about that access, and holding the manufacturer of these items accountable. Additionally, we've got SB 52731, which is our emergency domestic violence, no contact, and firearms relinquishment orders, which this bill provides authority for an officer to ask a judge on behalf of and with the consent of the victim to authorize an emergency domestic violence no contact order in order to surrender, and prohibits weapons or extreme risk protection orders where the officer has responded to domestic violence calls. And these emergency orders are effective immediately upon issuance until the initial court hearings or on the charges. Again, another thing that is most certainly important, we factor interpersonal relationships and those who are at risk in very unsafe conditions, especially around domestic violence. I think this was something really important to address, and I'm glad that we've addressed it with legislation, because, outside of, our global pandemic that was happening, I think people often thought, probably in that moment too, oh, well, we're safer from mass shootings, we're safer from all these other entities of harm that were caused by guns. But an unfortunate thing that was also happening, right, is people were stuck at home. So we're also now factoring folks who were stuck at home in unfortunate domestic situations, and now they were exposed to that harm even more. And folks, especially with firearms, were now, in homes that were unsafe for them. So it's really important that this has been passed as well to continue to address our harms. And even before I go to the next one, I hope that as you're also hearing these bills passed, right, that you can almost kind of get a sense and a feel that even these bills that are being passed are part of that ecosystem. They're not just directly targeted at one space, right? We're trying to look at this with a very wide scope approach, right? As we're talking around domestic violence protections, as we look around the assault weapons ban, as we look at waiting periods, we're trying to find and address multiple places and spaces that we can continue to address the harms that are caused. Additionally, we have HB 1230, which is our safe storage information requirements, which this bill requires the Department of Health to share information about the safe storage of prescription drugs, over-the-counter medicines, and firearms and ammunitions. And additionally, it requires school districts to post and have easy access to this information, and to ensure information is accessible through various communication means. This one was also really important, especially just to me as someone who in high school, days before our graduation, one of my best friends committed firearm suicide days before our graduation, right? And in that moment, for the lack of safe storage in his home. And I think, even going backtracking to, right, American youth, ages 19 and under, and when I say 19 and under, that is from birth to 19, right, are at risk with firearms at home not being safely stored, right? I go back, I don't even have to hearsay to talk to other communities that are at risk, right? I can live through my own experience at 5 years old for the lack of safe storage, holding a firearm by myself. And thankfully, right, didn't pull the trigger, didn't try to go any further in intrigue. But there's so many children out there every day who don't have those same stories, right? There are kids that may go to their friend's home and there might be a firearm not locked away, right, and the harms that could potentially happen to them. So it's really important with legislation like this as well, of those requirements and that information being passed out, especially in our schools, right? That information being passed out is important because we can continue to grow with our communities, educate our communities, right? Again, we're not telling them what to do, right? We're giving the information to show folks, hey, here's an option to make sure that you're keeping your household safe, right? Because if we can get that into every home in our communities, right, that education shows folks, hey, here's the percentages that your home is more safer with safe storage. Here's a percentage of safety when you're checking in with your other families to see if they have firearms. I've known people lately who, before their kids, right, go to a sleepover or go reach out to anyone, they have a talk with their child to say, hey, if there's a firearm out there and you see it, these are the things that you immediately need to do. And I think requirements, like this around safe storage, around information of sharing that out there will most certainly help continue to save lives, because as unfortunate as it is for folks that don't always safely store their items, there is a part of me that still knows that folks aren't always intentionally doing that, right? Folks aren't always aware of all the education and the information around these things to educate themselves on what they need to do to keep their community safe, right? I'd like to believe that the majority of parents out there most certainly don't want their child accessing that firearm, right? They may think they've told their child not to do something, right? But again, if you're 5 years old, there's always going to be that curiosity. And so just the importance of educating families, educating communities, and getting that information out there through our schools to educate folks on what they can be doing is so important. We've also got our HB 1562 around the restoration of firearm rights, which is reducing the risk of lethality and other harm associated with gun violence, gender-based violence, and other types of violence is the focus of this bill. And so to help reduce the risk of harm, including the risk of lethality and the disparate impact associated with gun violence and gender-based violence because of access to firearms, this bill updates the law prohibiting possession of firearms by persons convicted of certain crimes to cover additional types of offenses associated with violence, and strengthens the criteria and process by which they may petition to restore their firearm rights. I often like to say some of these bills that we pass, even last year, some of the ones that we passed, really just seek to expand the existing protections there for our communities. As in my world of strategy, I love to call it the RIR protocol, recognize, interrupt, and repair. And so one of the importance of bills like this just also seek to say, hey, listen, we can see, there's still some loopholes out there. There's some ways that harm could potentially be had amongst members in our community. So let's go back to the drawing table and let's just make sure that we've widened that scope of protections so that in all the places and all the spaces, right, we can continue to keep our community safe as best as possible. Additionally, adding to one of our last bills, the 8 of the 9, continuing around the domestic violence protections, was HB 1715, which enacted additional protections for victims of domestic violence, electronic monitoring with victim notification technology, and a pilot program to implement domestic violence high-risk teams to be adopted. Additional training for law enforcement is provided, and many provisions in law related to firearm relinquishment are strengthened, along with other life-saving measures thanks to this bill. Again, right, going back to COVID, right? People were locked away, and we may have thought that people being locked away exempted us from more gun violence, but you also had to factor folks being in unsafe homes now at the hands of their loved ones in the home due to domestic violence, and what that could mean, and the lethality, what that means for them being at home with that firearm and someone who, can cause harm directly within their four walls, right? Which just goes again to that point of, the good guy with a gun versus the bad guy with a gun. Again, more people are at risk at home when those firearms are at home than they are outside of those four walls. And then lastly, which wasn't a part of the 8 of the 9, but definitely a part of our advocacy work, was the investment in gun violence prevention. We're really happy this year with the legislator allocating $30 million in funding for various gun violence prevention programs this legislative session, a robust change from last year, where I think it was about somewhere between 8 to 10 million. We've had a great investment in this work and into that office. Gun violence continues at a record pace in Washington and the nation as a whole, and weighing heavily on our communities and highlighting how much work there is left to do is to create the safe future that we all deserve. And so this session really helped to support that, especially with the support of this office, our Office of Firearm Safety and Violence Prevention. I've gotten really good at now memorizing that lengthy title. That space is a place for, sharing out information. That's a space for grant making and supporting a lot of the on the ground, boots on the ground workers out there. Our organization is not a direct services provider, so we see the importance of our partners out there doing that direct service every day, right? Because without them, we leave ourselves open to more harm, right? The importance of CVI, community violence intervention programs, are so integral for our kids, right? They're so integral for all of our communities. But I harp especially, right, towards our kids. We're just doing some prep this week for an event next week, and we did a lot of interviews with youth and students from different schools in the area, and we did one recently with some kids in South Seattle, right? And they've been hosting town halls at school to talk about this, but something that was really important to them was this discussion of when we leave school, who's there to protect us when we're walking home or walking, on a corner to get home. And many of these programs are so important because they do just that. They make sure that our kids outside of school are protected, that they have spaces and places to be. We have partners who work with kids in that realm. We have partners who help mothers who are grieving because they've lost a child or they've lost a partner due to gun violence. And so being able to support this office with robust funding and support is really important to continue the work that we do, right? But I've listed a lovely, lengthy list of legislative victories and the work that will impact our community, which is also important that everybody hears those and they knows those, because these are things that will now be passed. Some have already enacted in our state that will help to continue to support the folks out there, right? But again, this is just a piece of the pie, if you will. It's a part of the ecosystem. I've been saying a lot lately. We all have been raised in the phrase, "It takes a village to raise a child," and I've been adding to that lately. It's going to take the village to protect the child, and so our work is a part of that village, right? When we talk about a public health approach as well, it's important that it's not just the Alliance for Gun Responsibility doing this work every day, right? It's many of our partners who are out there providing that CVI work, right? It's our Office of Firearm Safety and Violence Prevention, making sure that we have the resources to do that in all of our communities, right? It's working with our healthcare professionals to make sure that we are doing all that we can by our community. It's making sure that we're working with our gun, policy advocates that's out there. It's making sure that we work with everybody, all the places, all the spaces. If there's something that I hope you grab from me, you'll hear that in your brain after this time together, but really making sure that we've got everybody together in this space, working together, networking together, fighting together, because again, this is a mobilization of all of us working together. This is not just us siloed by ourselves. I think that was my first good part of my rabbit hole. And I think from here, I would love, if I'm looking at my producer in front of me, if I may even share some of the upcoming things that we are doing as we're talking about solutions, as we're talking around that work. The Alliance for Gun Responsibility, again, in all the different spaces under our C3, we do a lot of public programming that seeks to engage folks. And I would love to share one that we have been doing even recently that is called the Together We End Gun Violence Symposium, that has now become a 2-day conference that will be on May 25th and May 26th this year in Tacoma, Washington. That was something that was really important to us as a statewide organization, that work continues to travel outside of Seattle and King County, because all of our communities are impacted by this work. And so we most certainly should work in all of our different communities. But this is something that has truly been a baby of ours in partnership with a couple of other different folks out there, which I won't name all of them because I would certainly miss some of them. But this work seeks to really have a collective approach around addressing gun violence on a regional level, on a statewide level. And this work, brings together our thought leaders, our community members, our government officials, all working together to identifying and executing long-term solutions to combating gun violence here in Washington. And again, on our website, which is gunresponsibility.org, I encourage people to check that out and be a part of that if they would love to continue to be a part of this work, because that is going to be a space that we're looking to intentionally grow our connections with folks across the state. Again, because we're going to have a breakdown of sessions there where we're going to look at our cross-collaborative systems. We're going to look at a room for our healthcare professionals. We're going to look at school safety and what that looks like to work around public safety. We're going to look at public safety and law enforcement, right? Because we also realize that every community is impacted differently when it comes to law enforcement and their use of guns as well, because when we talk about gun violence, we also believe that includes police gun violence as well. And we want to bring everybody to that space together to really make sure that we're doing the best work with everybody who is a part of that work. Some other things that I would mention with my time is really the importance of advocacy. Or if there's anything that I can talk about outside of, in our mission, advocacy, education, and partnerships, is really the importance of advocacy, right? I mentioned earlier in this talk, just about 5 years ago, we have just moved the needle, if you will, to getting our legislatures here to be gun sense majority, right? And even in that time, right, it took time, arguably with a legislature that is primarily Democratic, right? I think folks can assume that means things, right? But we've been able to move that needle of having folks believe in this work and fight for this work with us. And it's important that there's anything from the multiple things that I've rambled today about is the importance of advocacy. Our work is not done without the help of you listening, you watching, and your voices being heard, your voices being loud, because that all is advocacy, right? And I know our legislatures hear it and they feel it and they need to hear it and feel it. We just last week had one of our victory parties to celebrate a very historic legislative session, and we had several elected officials there, right, who came and reminded us of this importance of, thank you for being there, thank you for showing up in orange, thank you for being loud, because that work that you do around advocacy is so important to them, right, because they do the work of the people. So it's important that the people are in all the places and spaces continuing to voice their opinions and the work. But, outside of advocacy, to harp, and as my closing, education, it's really important. The things that I say to you, right? Sharing any tidbits that you get from this moment, sharing that with other people, really sharing the importance of this work, sharing the laws that have now been passed, and making sure that people are educated on these laws, because they do impact the community, and it's important to know what is getting ready to happen, right? But our website hosts a plethora of things. If I really went through all the deep in the weeds of all the things on our website, we'd be here for 3 hours. But it's really important to, right, educate yourselves and to educate others, because I think something that folks don't always catch on to is, especially in this world of myth busting, there are so many myths out there around this space, and just educating yourself alone allows you to be able to combat any fallacies, any falsehoods with truth. So it's really important as well to, educate yourself first, and to make sure that you're spreading that education to others, right? Because when you know better, you do better, and you can impact better, if I may. And then partnerships. It's really important to continue to work with folks, to work with organizations, join in on organizations, join us if you haven't been a part of this work, because without our partners, we truly can't do this work. Because again, while we live in one lane of gun violence prevention, we work with our partners in domestic violence. We work with our partners in youth. We work with our partners in education. We work with our partners economically in different spaces, because gun violence, unfortunately, taps every space, every lane in this country. And so it's going to take everybody in their lanes collectively and collaboratively working together. And I think that will bring me to my conclusion, because I think there might be some questions for me. Yes. Yes. Come on over to the couch. That concludes my Tremaine podcast, TED Talk, all the things, rambling. Yes.
Well, I just want to thank you for the information that you shared with us regarding gun responsibility, because it's incredibly important to keep home safe. And I appreciate how you've contributed to our education. I've learned a lot tonight. I know our audience has learned a lot tonight. You touched on a lot of the questions that I have, you spoke about common misconceptions, myths regarding gun violence. Is there anything else you want to add in addition to that, or how to talk to those who aren't aware of those misconceptions? I think communication is probably the hardest part, especially when dealing with those of our friends and families who disagree. How would you go about communicating that?
I appreciate you asking that question, because that is something that I most certainly am glad that we didn't forget when we leave here today. I think something around conversations, I've had that quite a bit in my position. I remember even last year at our luncheon, I had a woman come up to me after and, was just really thankful of the day and the space. And she said, I've got some family members, right, who live on the other side of this space with me. And they've got young children and they're not locking them up. Like, how do I get to them? How do I get my foot in the door? And that is arguably a big question that often folks look at. And my first rebuttal to them always, and to anyone, is words matter. The language matters of how you go about conversations. Just a couple of months ago, I had a conversation with a gentleman who, arguably with some of our bills, was very vocal and against us. But then some of the other bills was completely in support of us. And I think something that helps us in these conversations is we never say gun control. We often say, gun violence prevention helps to get folks in that space sometimes if we feel like there's potentially a pushback from them, but also leading with facts, right? I find that leading with that information, right, if we talk about this as a public health approach as well, it kind of, for lack of better words, right, it disarms people to kind of come at us with their preconceived notions and, unfortunately, falsehoods, that when we come at this space, we talk about it as a public health approach, right? So when we say, oh, this is a public health approach, they're like, what are you talking about? Well, 45,000 people are dying on average in our country, but over 50% of that is people taking their lives themselves. Mass shootings, unintentional shootings, again, we never want to minimize those because we want to continue to highlight those, right? Actually, a small percentage of it. It's really people taking their lives out of the overwhelming percentage. And that usually helps as well with these conversations, that if you lead in this public health approach, if you talk around, firearm suicides being the leading cause of death, if you talk about it now being the leading cause of death for American youth, everybody at a baseline, notoriously most everybody, can agree that has to stop. So I will say, it's really important in those conversations, right? Again, educating yourself first and foremost of, on our website, we also have a list of, myth busters, if you will, so that when you hear those things, you know exactly how to respond to them, because, we hear that often, or we hear the often, it's not the people, it's the guns, look at Chicago, right? And our rebuttal to that, hey, we hear you, but you also have to realize Chicago is surrounded by a bunch of states who don't believe in the same things and the laws of Illinois, right? So folks can go across those state lines, get whatever they need to do, and come back in and cause harm. So again, it goes back to that space of, and this is why we all as a country need to have federal legislation. So I think in those spaces, it really helps to, again, right, educate yourself on all the facts so that when you hear those falsehoods, you know how to come back at them. But also coming at them from a public health lens usually helps just make it easier of a conversation, and it doesn't make it as political. I've at least found, even sometimes of conversations where I've been at public events where I've had people literally walk up to me and be like, well, you're not going to like me because I'm a firearm owner. And I'm like, well, let's try. Let's have a conversation. And I've had people walk away from those events and, we might still agree to disagree on some things, but I had a gentleman one time who was very vocal about it when he walked up to me. He walked away that day thanking me for the time to discuss things and being open-minded for it. And, again, we won't see eye to eye on everything, but that goes to show, right? If you come at it with facts, if you talk about it with a public health lens and approach, you talk about really gun violence prevention, it really helps get yourself in those conversations a little bit more and discuss what is happening as a community.
Yeah, I'm thinking about how incredibly helpful it is to find a baseline, because that's really the issue, right? When you're having a disagreement, how can you come together and start from there and then discuss? So that's very helpful. Thank you. It makes me wonder about how session went. What were some of the challenges that you faced, even though you had said we do have a primarily Democratic legislature? How was session?
On behalf of my peers who lived even more deeply than I did this year, I know the first biggest thing was there was a lot of uncertainty, right? This was the first time since COVID hit that it was an in-person session. So we didn't know what we didn't know, right? A lot of people were feeling it out to the umpteenth moment, even in the legislature, of what the rules were going to look like, what the capacity was going to look like, how we're going to navigate this. And we didn't know what opposition was going to look like, right? Because in prior years, prior to COVID, for the lack of laws matter, laws change things, right? Our witnesses would go up and testifiers would go up in a space where people were allowed just years ago, before these laws were passed, before COVID. In your legislature here in Washington State, people could walk into the chambers with their firearms. And I heard stories just last week of our legislators talking about, while they were hearing testimony, while they were on the floor speaking, sometimes folks would just bring their firearms and aim down to intimidate. So we didn't know what was potentially going to happen. But thanks to laws passing, right, we know that this year they couldn't bring them on the grounds. So that made it really great for our testifiers, for folks especially who have been survivors and victims, to feel so much safer in this space this year. But we don't, when you line up for those legislative days, you're lining up with your opposition and folks, and you are all there together. I will say, maybe a reflection of the times that are happening, at least in this community here, we outnumbered them, especially in person throughout the session. And I think something that we like to think that we have, and I know that we have, is the quality of our testimony, right? We have survivors coming up here and sharing bravely their stories. So that most certainly helped. And this is also a longer session. So in our odd number years, you have about 105 days to be able to, get bills across between both chambers and get passed. So this year was probably a little bit easier in that lift of making that work done. But it still was a lot of phone calls and a lot of emailing and a lot of texting, because we had to get boots on the ground in person this year, and that has not happened for a while. So I would say overall, very victorious year, but a very laborious year to get people back into the grand scheme of things, and a lot of uncertainty of just not knowing what was going to happen. But I think overall we were very happy and pleased that, again, 9 of our bills, 8 of the 9 got passed, and we continuously showed up loud in our orange, which is very much the color for the gun violence prevention movement. So we were very pleased and very surprised. A very historic session for us as well. We've never passed that many bills as an entity for a session.
Yeah, I wanted to say earlier when you let us know, I wanted to shout congratulations, because I've been following session, and that was something that was really important to me. So congratulations. I know it's been a lot of hard work and you faced a lot of challenges. I guess my last question for the evening, do you have any additional information or tidbits the website has to offer that you want to leave the audience with tonight? Any more thoughts about the future moving forward?
I guess for the future, I will tease, stay tuned, because in our policy team, we're like, don't give it all away. There are things that they're still working through. I think the perk of this legislative session, if I would add, is being able to get such monumental change through our legislature, whereas this organization historically started as a ballot initiative organization. We moved away from that and working through our legislature to get bills passed. And so there's now this kind of exciting time to reimagine what work we can get done through our elected officials. So I think for the future, stay tuned, but also stay in tune with us, because everybody's voices matter in crafting what that legislation looks like. It takes the will of the people to voice what their wills are to make that into a bill. But certainly stay tuned there. I would say, as a overarching thing, check out our website, gunresponsibility.org. It has all the who, what, when, where, and whys for all the things that we're doing and how you can plug in.
Well, oh, sorry, we do have another question. What was the statistic that you gave about reducing gun deaths in Washington from 74% to 71%? What were those percentages? Was that it?
Yeah, so that one specifically was around firearm deaths in our community. When we look at, gun deaths in our community, firearm gun deaths account for about 70 odd percent, which was about 74%, and it dropped down the last couple of years. Oh, yes. Yeah, our firearm gun deaths. So our total, when we look at our deaths by guns, it's about firearm suicide, are 74%. So when we look at our gun deaths, thank you for that clarifying question. When we look at our gun deaths in our community especially, right, you can have suicide, you can have homicide, you can have unintentional shootings, you can have mass shootings, right? There's all of these different, I would say, categories of how we go about that, but an overwhelming majority of that is firearm gun deaths in our community, which again has dropped. We want to take that down to 0, but is an alarming rate of gun deaths in our community is by firearm suicide in our state, which is higher than the national average by over 10 some odd percent.
I was going to say, when you shared that statistic, I remember learning about that last year when I worked for Representative Shelley Kloba, and it's really comforting to know, while it's still a high percentage, that it's gone down and that there's work to be done and work planning to be done to continue to reduce it. So thank you for sharing that information. And just another general thank you for being here with us tonight and educating us. That was a super illuminating and amazing experience to gain more information on gun responsibility. So thank you for being here. Yeah, we appreciate you. And now I'll give a little outro as we wrap up. Thank you all for joining us tonight. And if you're viewing this before May 20th of 2023, there is still time to come see the Squirrel Plays, and you can learn more about our show on our website at mirrorstage.org. Thank you again, and have a great evening.